The American President Lyndon Johnson doubted that bombing North Vietnam would be enough to save the South. By now, he was resigned to using American troops to fight the guerrillas. The first combat units had already landed. Johnson's biggest worry, shared by his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, was that bombing North Vietnam might spark off a much bigger war. The Soviet Union and China had been supporting the North with financial and military aid for years. If the American bombing was too fierce, they might be forced to come to its defense. After that, anything could happen. Johnson's fears that the war in Vietnam could spiral out of control were not shared by his military leaders. The Joint Chiefs of Staff did not believe that the Chinese or the Soviets would intervene no matter how hard the U.S. hit the North. What they wanted was a quick and devastating campaign. Whatever the doubts of his military leaders, Johnson was sure that massive bombing of North Vietnam would draw in the Chinese. The only course the president could see was to keep strict control of the offensive himself. Each week, the list of targets to be struck would have to be approved by him at the White House. The first American bombing raids had come as a severe shock to the leaders of North Vietnam. Neither the President Ho Chi Minh nor his government had expected the Americans to go so far. But there was no question of giving in. On April 8, 1965, Premier Pham Van Dong replied to a peace overture from the American president with his own list of uncompromising demands. For 10 years, Ho Chi Minh's aim had been to reunite the two halves of Vietnam under communist rule. Now the NLF guerrillas in the south were so close to victory, he saw no reason why he should negotiate. The problem was, if the North were bombed into oblivion or invaded by American and South Vietnamese forces, all would be lost. Only with massive help from the Soviet Union and China could North Vietnam hope to survive. The two superpowers had already given nearly $1 billion worth of aid over 10 years, but Ho was appealing urgently for more. Ho meant to play on the bitter rivalry between the two powers to get all the help he could. At first, the Soviet Union under Premier Alexei Kosygin had urged northern leaders to look for a peaceful solution. But Kosygin was actually in Hanoi in February 1965 when Rolling Thunder began. The Russian position hardened. The Soviets now promised sophisticated radar, air defense missiles, and more jet fighters. China, under its leader Mao Zedong, went much further than the Soviet Union. Mao promised to send combat infantry if the country were invaded. Meantime, to help the North defend itself against the bombing, he promised anti-aircraft units. From the start, the American bombing offensive against North Vietnam was meant to meet a whole range of different objectives. The military chiefs, including Admiral Sharp, the commander of U.S. Pacific Forces, wanted to wreck the North's capacity to make war. The U.S. ambassador in Saigon, Maxwell Taylor, saw the raids as a morale booster for South Vietnam. The Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, meant them to put on pressure, which could be stepped up gradually until the North agreed to U.S. demands. The first targets of the Rolling Thunder campaign had been chosen mainly for their political and psychological impact. However, to justify the mounting toll of lost pilots and aircraft, McNamara now wanted more concrete results. He argued that the campaign against North Vietnam should be much more closely linked to the war in the South. The new American plan for Operation Rolling Thunder focused on the part of North Vietnam between the demilitarized zone, separating North and South, and the 20th parallel. Inside this area, railway lines, bridges, and a vital rail yard at Vinh were all used to send supplies and reinforcements to guerrilla units in the South. These lines of communication were to be cut in a 3-week campaign which would steadily move north. Armed reconnaissance would then destroy the transport trapped by the broken bridges and rail lines. To U.S. military leaders, the decision to attack North Vietnamese transport was a move in the right direction, but it was nowhere near as destructive as the campaign they wanted. President Johnson and Robert McNamara were adamant that there would be no all-out campaign. This was to be a limited war to achieve limited objectives. In any case, McNamara and other officials argued, the most valuable targets should be kept as hostages. To save those, North Vietnam would have to agree to negotiate. When the Rolling Thunder campaign had begun, North Vietnam's leaders had feared that in a very short time, their country could be bombed into rubble. The air defense system was still primitive. If the Americans meant to launch an all-out offensive, there was little the fledgling North Vietnamese Air Force could do to stop them. North Vietnam hoped that open support from its allies, particularly the Chinese, could save it from full-scale attack. There was every sign the Chinese meant what they said about coming to the North's aid if necessary. In fact, China was taking the situation in Vietnam so seriously, it had changed its whole national defense strategy. Mao Zedong had long recognized that by helping North Vietnam, he was risking a direct clash with the United States. He was determined to prepare. Mao ordered a massive defense program to ensure China could withstand even a nuclear attack by the United States. He called it the Third Front, and by March 1965, it was already well underway. The first stage of the Third Front program had been to take China's industries, mostly concentrated around the big cities, and split them in two. The duplicates were then moved deep into the interior. Already, fortifications were being built for defense in depth, and every province was creating its own light armaments industry. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's defenses against American bombing were also being reinforced. China had already moved 4 full air divisions and an anti-aircraft division to its border with Vietnam. It built airfields close to the frontier as sanctuary and repair facilities for North Vietnam's jet fighters. Inside Vietnam, new airfields would be built and old ones repaired. Chinese logistic teams were already constructing or upgrading 12 roads north of Hanoi. In North Vietnam, full-scale mobilization was being carried out at a frantic pace. Many believed that an invasion might follow the air assault. 1 million people were organized into repair and construction teams. In a massive program, they dug thousands of miles of trenches and millions of single-person air raid shelters. Soon, in Hanoi, there would be a shelter on average every 20 feet. To the leaders of the North, building defenses and acquiring advanced weaponry was only one part of the strategy. There was also the political battle. There would be a major propaganda offensive to pressure the Americans into restricting or even stopping their attacks. For more than 20 years, American military planning had given the highest priority to strategic bombers. The U.S. had built a huge force of long-range aircraft able to attack targets deep inside the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. As the conflict with North Vietnam had intensified, Strategic Air Command had modified its giant B-52s to carry conventional bombs. Although the B-52s had been stationed ready to attack North Vietnam, in the end they had been kept out of Rolling Thunder. The White House believed that the massive high-altitude bombers were just too destructive. They could be seen as a massive escalation of the war. Instead, the smaller and more accurate tactical bombers would fight the strategic campaign against the North. They would also carry out their normal role by supporting ground operations in South Vietnam. While the Air Force and Marine aircraft would fly most missions inside South Vietnam, a large part of the strikes against the North would be mounted by the Navy. The U.S. Navy had 16 strike carriers and deployed more aircraft than all the world's other navies combined. By the end of 1965, 10 different carriers would have taken part in Rolling Thunder operations over North Vietnam. U.S. naval air power off Vietnam was under the command of Task Force 77. Its carriers would operate from two areas, codenamed Yankee and Dixie stations. Aircraft from Yankee Station would attack targets in North Vietnam and Laos, while planes from Dixie would fly over South Vietnam.